If anyone has ever tried to convince you to watch One Piece, they probably gave you a moment or an arc in the show. You have to at least watch until blank. It's understandable, it's a long show, and it's hard to keep investing in it when you haven't seen the returns you were expecting. I truly believe that there is something in the show for everyone, and if time were not such a precious resource, I would tell everyone that they should watch until they're hooked. It will inevitably happen. That being said, I too have a specific moment that I tell people to reach before abandoning the golden yarn that is One Piece. The walk to Arlong Park is that moment for me. It isn't necessarily my favorite moment in the whole series because, frankly, we're only in the foothills of this mountain range. That being said, it was the first time that I realized the power of Oda's storytelling. One might say that 37 episodes is too much to ask someone to watch if they aren't loving it. I would say it's like cooking a nice steak. The preparation is crucial, but regardless of what you do to it, you need to let it rest if you want it to reach perfection. Enough time needs to pass for the cooking to finish and for Oda's web of foreshadowing to mature. That's the only way to get moments like this. But before we get to that, let's take a look at how we got here. You know that this flashback is going to hurt when there's a backstory within the backstory. For now, I want to focus on what Oda is trying to say about the concept of love. Not referring so much to a romantic love, but more of what drives a loving bond between any two people. We've seen several of these bonds, between Shanks and Luffy, Queen and Zoro, Kai and Usopp, and Zeph and Sanji. Is there a common thread that runs through all of them? It's a little complicated. It's the differences in their circumstances that highlight the commonality of their bond. Life is illogical, both in our own world and in One Piece. It can make the world a cruel place where cruel things happen. We've seen plenty of this already on the crew's journey through the East Blue. For many people, it's easier to attempt to impose logic on the world. Logic like, pirates are bad and the Marines are good. Sometimes that's the only way to get by. But love, like life, is illogical, and it doesn't neatly fit into the logical systems we build up to protect ourselves. Let's start at the flashback within a flashback and consider Bellemare. She was a kid who always got into trouble and then one day decided to become a Marine so she could do good for the world. We see her beaten and bloody, resigned to her own death on the battlefield when she sees Nojiko carrying Nami. It's Nami's smile that breaks through Bellemare's beleaguered state and reminds her why life is worth living. It can sometimes be a trap, following our own logical systems that we've built right up until the day we die. Yet it's this illogical smile of an innocent child amongst the fire and destruction that saved Bellemare, Nojiko, and Nami. Bellemare found the strength to carry on because she wanted to protect these two girls. She makes it back to the village with them, and when they are all safe and recovering from their ordeal, Gen tries to convince her to give the two girls up for adoption. Everything that he says to her in this moment is a logical argument. Bellemare is alone in the world, and she has very little money. But she's firm in her belief to do what appears illogical. These two girls are not related to her, but Bellemare realizes that this doesn't matter. She has seen how awful and terrifying the world can be. It doesn't matter if she will need to work and struggle. She wants to protect these girls as her own. It's the love that she feels that allows her to see past the logic that they aren't her biological daughters. But Nami is a smart kid, and even at the age of 10, she's begun to learn the logic that we all superimpose onto the world. She sees Bellemare suffering in order to take care of them, and she says something that cuts right to Bellemare. If they had been adopted by someone rich, they all would have been better off. It's only when Nami hears the start of her own story that she realizes the cruelty in her words and that Bellemare's love for her is so strong because she chose to be Nami and Nojiko's mother. Even the rest of the town reflects on how happy they are to be able to help raise these two girls. Remember at the start, I said that life and love are illogical. We may try to make rules to make sense of the chaos that is life, but it all inevitably fails. That's not to say that following love over logic is a painless process. We see it in Nami's words that cut Bellemare, in Gen having to keep the two girls out of trouble, but we also see the reward here in the way that Bellemare's act of love has sparked so much more. Unfortunately, the world is often cruel, especially with its timing. Arlong arrives on the day that Nami had this fight with Bellemare, when Bellemare decided to cook a feast to apologize, and the smoke caught Arlong's eye. Bellemare prepares a meal that will likely never be eaten, Nojiko and Nami run to save their mother, and Arlong moves steadily closer to ripping this family apart. There's nothing surprising about Belle-Mère sacrificing herself for Nami and Nojiko. What is surprising is when she chooses to sacrifice herself. When Belle-Mère confesses that the money she gave to Arlong wasn't for her but for her 2 daughters, it felt like they were in the clear. So why did she do it? Well, we find out later that Arlong had thought ahead, destroying all of the ships to prevent any villagers from escaping. Belle-Mère didn't know that at the time. Perhaps she just couldn't stomach the feeling of denying her daughter's existence. I think that's part of it, but Belle-Mère was a Marine and she knows how cruel pirates can be. She might have predicted Arlong's tactics, but it feels more like she knew the repercussions of paying for herself and denying that Nami and Nojiko exist. She would be putting them in danger, so even if it means her own death, she wanted to be their mother through the end. What makes it particularly painful is how Belle-Mère raised Nami and Nojiko. Although she had to struggle and scrape by to support them, she didn't allow her circumstances to change the way that she felt towards her kids. She did everything that she could to shield these girls from the ugliness of the world, but the ugliness found them. It's what makes her sacrifice all the more heartbreaking. After raising these girls to be resilient and trying to give them a happy life absent from the pain that she's felt, all she can do now is tell them she loves them, as her execution is burned into their minds forever.
Nojiko! Nami! 大好き
Nami barely has a moment to take in her mother's death when she is grabbed by the fisherman pirates and dragged away while watching her entire village get beaten down. Despite only being 10 years old, and despite having to work for the very man who killed her mother, Nami keeps a smile on her face so that she can keep the ones she loves safe. Belle-Mère told her to live and not to allow the world to turn her into a cold and uncaring individual. But the question is, will she be able to follow this advice? In the last 2 episodes, we discussed why Belle-Mère chose to sacrifice herself when she did, and the legacy that she left behind for Nami and Nojiko. But at first, it feels like Nami has turned her back on Belle-Mère and all that she taught her. Gen wonders if Nami considered Belle-Mère her parent at all. Of course, she was only trying to mask her fear and her pain so that no more people would die trying to protect her. With the Navy doing nothing, Nami fights for the town for the next 8 years. She grows up as a thief, having to take dangerous trips out to sea to try and steal whatever she can to get closer to 100 million berries. On top of all of this, she believes herself to be a pariah in town, the witch of Kokoyashi village who can't be trusted. Belle-Mère told her and Nojiko to live, and Nami has done that. Barely. But has Nami been able to keep the hate of the world from her heart? It seems like an impossible task given the reality facing her. She did the best she could, choosing to steal from pirates. It might be more dangerous, but she just didn't want to harm innocent people. All of that has taken a toll on her. If you are constantly forced to face the worst of the world, it's hard not to begin to expect it. Her shock at witnessing Luffy's kindness, and even her willingness to believe the villagers had turned on her, shows how dark the world is for Nami. To her, everything that the villagers said about her was true. Regardless of her motivations, she was still choosing to work with the very people who had killed her mother. Then we find out that the villagers' coldness was all done with the hope that she would stop risking her life for them and escape. They underestimated the depth of Nami's love for them. Even if they hated her, she could not abandon them. It took almost a decade, but she never gave up. Remember back to that moment when Johnny and Yosaku swam up to Baradier and told them that Nami had stolen the cruise ship and treasure? Well, Oda likes to do things like this. A character will do something that feels odd, or in Nami's case, even despicable, and other characters will voice some of our own suspicions. When we get the context, it's particularly crushing because I, for one, jumped to conclusions about Nami. Now, we know that Nami chose to betray her friends to save her village, that it tortured her to steal from people she cared about, but that she thought it was the best way to keep them safe. To know that she risked 8 years of grueling, dangerous work to protect her friends, it hurts me even more that I thought she had just stabbed her friends in the back. But there is one person who never, for a moment, doubted Nami. Luffy sent Zoro and Usopp to go after her. Not for retribution, but because they're friends and he wanted to keep sailing together. Luffy believes the best in everyone, but especially his friends. After all that has happened, Luffy is still waiting on the island, waiting for her to ask him for help. But Nami just can't see that. Nami's sacrifice is real and more than should be asked of anyone. Belmare's hope for her not to hate the era she is in seems to be in vain. She was almost forced to become detached, but as we see, Nami was less alone than she thought. Her sacrifice is tragic not only because of her circumstances, but because she was never as alone as she thought. It's an important reminder that if we only expect the worst from people, that's often what we'll get. It does feel important to note here, though, that Nami has been fighting for her village since she was 10 years old. She's been forced to risk her life to save her village from pirates. If only there were a government-backed organization that was meant to protect the innocent civilians from pirates. "8 years ago, Gen told the villagers that the Navy was overwhelmed fighting pirates in the Grand Line, and that it was unlikely they would receive any help from them. 8 years have passed, and it seems like Gen overestimated the amount of help they would receive from the Navy. We haven't seen much from the Marines since the first couple of episodes when Luffy rescued Zoro from Captain Morgan, yet even in that short instance, we saw the dangers of power left unchecked. Any system that uses force to maintain order must be constantly examined and kept in check, because it's easy for individuals to use the power granted to them by that system to oppress the people that they're meant to serve. Granted, a Navy ship did try to help by attacking Arlong Park, but they were swiftly defeated. A moment like that can often go unexamined. Oda likely wanted to demonstrate the power of Arlong and his crew, but I believe he's saying a little bit more. Remember, the survivors of Goso were able to reach out to the Navy. We see the very formal commander of the Navy ship claim that as men of the Navy, they cannot allow a pirate settlement like Arlong Park to exist so openly. You could be generous to them and say that they were just trying to do their best, but I'd remind everyone that they were contacted to rescue innocent people. Purely from a humanitarian standpoint, it's pretty reprehensible if you forego rescuing villagers to launch a violent attack instead. Unfortunately for Nami and the entire Kokoyashi village, they aren't just affected by the incompetence of the Navy, but are actively harmed by a corrupt individual using his power to terrorize the people he's supposed to protect. It does sort of explain why Belmare taught her daughters to survive the dangerous era that they lived in, but never encouraged them to join this pillar of justice. Perhaps she saw things in her time as a Marine that showed her more could be done outside of the system. Is Oda making a sweeping indictment of the Navy and, metaphorically, the police in general? I don't think that's the case either. We have seen how the Navy attracts people like Kobe who buy into the ideals of the organization. The Navy's entire purpose should be to fight for and serve innocent civilians. Instead, it feels like there is a line being drawn. While some people are trying to do good within a corrupt system, there are far more that put on the Navy uniform because they want to wield power. When the Navy captain follows Arlong's orders and takes the 100 million berries away from Nami, he claims that it's for justice, as the money was originally stolen. He not only uses the power granted to him by the government to line his own pockets, but he also shoots Nojiko, a completely innocent bystander. It's hard not to see the parallels in our own world. The list of innocent people murdered and brutalized by the police only continues to grow. I believe that Oda is making a point outside of determining if there are good Marines or good cops. Clearly there are some, as we see with Belmare and Kobe, but we also see that their goodness cannot overcome a system that is already so broken. It appears Oda recognizes the fact that a police force lacking oversight at best becomes complacent to the people that it is meant to protect, and in some cases becomes as sinister as the criminals they're meant to stop. At the very least, Oda is asking what can be done when the systems of justice abandon and abuse its people. Which do you think is crueler? Arlong telling Nami a lie that drove her to risk her life again and again, or Arlong telling her the truth that she and the villagers will never be free? He doesn't even bother with the charade of an honorable deal involving money. This time, if she runs away, he will kill everyone in Kokoyashi village. It only gets worse as we see Nami running to stop the villagers from storming Arlong Park. Even if she must serve as Arlong's navigator for the rest of her life, she is prepared to do it to keep the villagers safe. But we see that the villagers are no longer allowing themselves to be used as collateral. They know that they won't survive this fight, but they are done living under Arlong's rule. They can no longer watch as Nami is trapped because she cannot let them go. Their plan might not make much sense, but what else can they do? What can any of them do? The Navy at best is ineffective, and at worst, vile and corrupt on every level. Arlong and his men are powerful and cruel. Arlong and his men sailed the Grand Line with one of the 7 warlords. They're in a completely different league. Not only that, but they view humans as a lesser species, so any attempt to reason with them is impossible. Even when Nami had friends that wanted to help her, she pushed them away. Of course, now that we know her backstory, it's easier to see why. After spending her whole life trying to save the people she cares about the most, it was too much to imagine losing the new friends she'd made. They didn't know the burden she carried when she met them. How can she now ask for their help after betraying them and telling them to leave? As we hear Arlong's laugh ringing through Nami's head, we're here in the darkest, most desperate moment. The villagers are marching to their death, and all she can do is stab her tattoo, the permanent reminder of the man who killed her mother and lied to her for 8 years. But Luffy stops her. He admits that he has no idea what has been happening on the island over the past 8 years, but he's still there. She tells him again to leave and that she doesn't need him. Luffy says nothing. He doesn't know why she insulted him, why she stole from him, and why she told him multiple times that she doesn't care about him or anyone else on the crew. Now that she is on the verge of losing the very villagers she fought to save for 8 years, she breaks down and asks Luffy for help. And Luffy doesn't hesitate, as he gives her his straw hat, his most prized possession, and screams that of course he will help her. The depth of Luffy's empathy allows him to see through everything that Nami has done up until this point. He doesn't need to know the exact details because he knows that Nami is a kind person. Even when she tells him that she never viewed them as friends and that she wants him to leave the island, he has stayed because he can see that Nami is in trouble. This whole time he has been waiting for her to ask him for help. All of that and the stories we've been told about Zoro, Usopp, and Sanji, if you watch this scene and feel nothing, I will concede that perhaps One Piece may not be worth the time for you. If Luffy rallying his crew to put their lives on the line for their friend, maybe this isn't the show for you, because it's a moment that is so pure. There is nothing for them to gain from this, and there's also no ulterior motive. The danger is real, but none of them hesitate. As they march toward this fight that will determine the future of the East Blue, their determination is palpable. They could leave and never need to confront Arlong, but this is a story about fighting for freedom and friendship. It's a story about uniting under the cause of empathy. Empathy that isn't defined by the government or the Navy. And if this is the end, if this is where you decide to watch something else, just know that there's always room on this crew if you change your mind. This moment captures why I love One Piece, and I feel like it needs to be said. This past week, I've continued to draw comparisons between One Piece and our own world. I asked what Nami and the villagers can do when it feels like hope is lost, and even the pillars of justice like the Navy work to oppress them. The answer was to ask Luffy for help, but then what are we supposed to do? That answer is a little more complicated, but Oda seems to have some ideas. Being kind to each other, asking each other for help, and answering that call even if it doesn't serve your immediate interests. Our world doesn't have an idealistic youth made of rubber taking down the corruption and vileness of the world, but perhaps by watching his journey, we can find our own ways to bring the world Luffy envisions to our own. If you enjoyed the video and want to join me on our journey through One Piece, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And without further ado, enjoy the walk to Arlong Park. Much for watching. I would love to hear from you all what moment you became a ride or die One Piece fan in the comments below. And all I have left to say is